Hola, you are listening to First Gen Healing, a podcast on Latinx healing and awakening journeys. My name is Priscila Luna. I'm your host. And I have a really special guest with us. Christie from Decolonized Motherhood is here. So welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being on. Do you feel comfortable sharing just a little bit about what that is? Because I think that name alone is so powerful. So a little bit about you and a little bit about that, por favor.
Of course. And thank you. First and foremost, thank you so much for having me here. I love sharing about this. I'm so passionate about this. Decolonized motherhood started, from this concept of when I had my daughter 10 years ago. I'm going to do things a little bit different or a lot different, to be realistic, than how I was raised, right? Than how I was parented. I'm going to do things differently with her, right? And it started from this idea of how do I break away from some of the unhealthy, toxic elements that are tied within like culture, generations, etc. when it comes to parenting, right? And so I started to share that with friends, community, family, which led into a podcast that was called Vida with Christie podcast. So I ran that for a few years. And then that started to evolve as we started to get into terminology of intergenerational healing and breaking intergenerational cycles, which I realized I was like, wait a second, I didn't have a name for it, but that's what I've been doing, right? And so that led into getting into academia. And I said, if I'm going to do this work within academia, but it only sits within these walls of an ivory tower, then how is that serving communities? How is that serving mothers, children, families, etc., right? Because this really, everybody has some type of connection with motherhood in some way or another, whether you're a mother yourself, you have one, etc., right? And so it's a really significant impact. So the idea of decolonizing is recognizing how no matter what your background is, no matter who you are, we live in a colonial system. We live in a system that has foundations of colonialism. How does that affect us in everyday life? And particularly mothers fall victims to these systems of oppression. And so through this work, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but it's like, how do you brick by brick start to dismantle those systems of oppression within your own life to essentially raise your children in healthier ways than you were raised and be a healthier person? Because we know that if mothers are not okay, families are not okay, right? So therefore it's tough work. It's not easy work. A lot of the times it's a lot of inner work, recognizing a lot of elements about your identity, your life, etc. But the goal here is that our children will have a healthier future, and the generations to come, when we become ancestors, will have a healthier living and wellness as well.
Woo. Such an important topic, and I feel like there must be so much to it, not only externally with the systems, but then internally, because I think like institutions feel big and feel like there's conditioning around motherhood or just how society operates. But then you can also think about like our families, and our families are also sometimes really strong, and there's barriers there that need to be broken. And then you can even go internally. So like managing your own system, whether it's your nervous system, your ego, your everything, your emotions. So I feel like this is such a juicy topic, and I'm excited to dive into it. Yeah. So I think my first question is, you mentioned you had a daughter 10 years ago. Back then, did you already have your podcast, or was that started post?
No, I started that when my podcast started when she was a toddler. So I just really wanted to share different episodes on, just how I'm approaching this. I've always been very much of a critical thinker. So I was looking at not only different topics, but also interviewing different women who, were mothers, had some, or other women who had some type of subject matter expertise in their field of parenting, etc., that could support our mother, communities, and
Mm.
to be healthier, to be better for their children, right? And then through that, it started to weave into raising aware and empowered children, because I think that's a big part that is a little bit of taboo traditionally in our, especially Latinx communities, of we don't talk to our children about certain things, or we don't talk to
Yeah.
them like at all. You know what I mean? So that was one
Right.
key element that I was like, I want to do that differently. I want to have a
Mm.
conversation with my daughter about sex, for example. I want to have a
Mhm.
conversation with my daughter about all these different elements that were so like, just don't do it. But we don't talk about it, but just don't do it. you know?
Right. Yeah.
So there's so many things. So I started to talk about that. Like I did an episode, how do you talk to your children about race? I had a mom who was enlisted in the military, and she was off in Germany, and she shared her experience. Because I feel like, as much as we love academia and we love all these fancy titles and things, lived experiences, it's important to recognize that they're just as important.
Yes. And I've noticed that, like, in the first gen community, which it makes a lot of sense, but we like to think through and analyze, and sometimes we get stuck there in the wanting to understand, but the embodiment piece can be really hard for us, like the embodying what we're learning and actually integrating that be really scary. It can feel far away from us.
Mhm.
So I wonder, like, how did you start to bring into awareness what you wanted to shift? Was it a result of these conversations that you were having? Maybe were you going to therapy or things like that prior to,
Yeah.
when you had already identified them? What did that kind of look like for you?
First and foremost, I want to recognize that a lot of this work requires privilege, and it's important to
Mm.
recognize that.
Mhm. Mhm.
Something like access to therapy
Yeah.
requires privilege, right? Being able to do things differently sometimes outside of your family. Let's say you live with your parents and you're trying to raise a child at the same time. And, let's say like your mom is taking care of your child while you're at work, kind of thing. It's hard
Yeah.
you're met with a lot of resistance, right? Oftentimes.
Mhm.
So it's important to first and foremost recognize that doing this work, there is a level of privilege required, right? So that's why I always say like it's so important that this is a no judgment zone, in the sense of that
Yeah.
sometimes folks have certain um, obstacles in their life that they're not able to embrace it and go full on into this. That's why I say it's not a full one size fits all. It's everybody's got their own definition and approach. So in my
Right.
personal experience, I was able to um, thankfully have conversations with particularly my mom, that I wanted to raise her like this, and my daughter like this, and I wanted to do things a certain way, and consent was a really big thing for me, especially in our culture where everybody wants to kiss the baby, and that's not
Mm.
healthy. Don't
Mhm.
kiss the baby.
Mm.
So how do we set
Okay.
those boundaries? Like that was one of the first things
Yeah.
we were met with, right? And I remember even my husband's family, that was a little bit more of a challenging conversation, because on his end, he wasn't as open. His family, I guess, dynamic isn't as wasn't as open at the time to having those conversations to say, I'm setting a boundary.
Right.
So that was a challenge, right? So it's always like baby steps, because you will be met with resistance in some way or another, right?
Mm. Mhm.
Um, so
I
yeah, those were big things, right? Just having that communication, and making sure, if you have a partner that you're co-parenting with, also making sure that you're both on the same page. It's having those conversations,
mm.
ideally even before you bring a child into the world, of like making sure we are on the same page, right?
Yeah.
As to how we want to raise our child, how we're going to
Yeah.
approach this. And I know life happens; it's not always planned, but it's having those conversations that's so so important, that allow you to really baby steps. It's really baby steps. No one's gonna
Mm.
go in full force and dismantle all the things,
Yeah.
and that's how I was able to achieve that.
Mm. Yes, I imagine it's a million different mini steps. And I
Hmm.
think I want to stay here before we move on and talk about
Yeah.
I think something that sticks with first gens a lot, or that I hear constantly, is the fear of el que dirán. So whether you're
Mm-hmm.
going from people pleaser to taking up space to becoming your authentic self, which is, kind of the topics I center around, it's always that fear that holds people back. And I'm picturing you as a mom, and I'm wondering if you received or even perceived. Sometimes it's not said in your face, but you perceive like te hacen caras, hacen comentarios, ya se cree mucho, o mira ya está sangrona. Like there's these terms that people use and that can be really harsh. And in reality, like what you're doing is coming from a beautiful place, but they don't see it that way. So I'm wondering, is that something that was top of mind as you started this journey for yourself?
Yeah, there was definitely a part of that, and comments were made, right? They're made in front of your face, like,
Mm,
you know, la gente es descarada, like, it's like, but it's like they think it's so normal, it's okay, and you have, like, la tía tóxica that's gonna say things to you and
yeah.
whatever. But, I always that's part of breaking an intergenerational cycle within ourselves of
Mm,
it's okay to be a malcriada sometimes because you're setting your boundaries. They're not raising your children,
mm,
you are. They're not responsible
yeah.
for your children, you are. Right? It's okay to be a malcriada. It's okay to be a rebelde. Like embrace that. And I know that's hard when you're nurtured your whole life to be maybe obedient, to be that people pleaser, to be, but again, baby steps, find where you can test those boundaries a little bit.
Yeah.
A big point of critique for me was making the decision to only have one child,
Mm,
right?
mm-hmm.
There was a lot to be said about that, right? Everybody's
Yeah.
like, oh, pero ¿cuándo va a venir el hermanito? Que quiere un hermanito? Like, and I was always like, ¿por qué el hermanito? ¿Por qué no la hermanita? I already have a girl.
Yeah.
Why does it have to be a boy? I'm not breeding them. No los voy a
Mm.
cruzar. like, like,
Yeah.
and so, there was like, and I would sometimes just the people I was comfortable with, like one of my mom's, one of her closest friends would always ask me like, oh, ¿y cuándo viene el otro? ¿Y cuándo el hermanito? Y yo le dije una de frente, le dije una vez, like, no los voy a cruzar, ¿por qué tienen que ser de dos diferentes géneros? Le dije. Y se quedó like,
Mm. Yeah.
and at the end of the day, me vale madre. Like that's like one of my favorite phrases in the world, me vale. I'm also a girl that grew up with like Gloria Trevi of like, and
Mm.
I really love that Thalia song. ¿A quién le importa?
Yeah.
Right? I just, I had those messages always growing up. Like,
Yeah.
and I always think that to my grandmother and my aunt, her sister, my great aunt, who raised me, and they planted those seeds of rebellion in me.
Mm.
And that was when I was living in Peru because I immigrated to Canada when I was 7. And so they planted those seeds of rebellion very early on, and like it's it's interesting because a lot of the times, like, it is true, like you think without even meaning, there's like this little voice in the back of your head that's like que dirán
Yeah.
if, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I always came up with like smart comments of like, for example, like they kept going. Even my dad was like, one time he was like, oh, pero si no tienes más de un hijo, es como que no es una familia.
Wow.
And so I looked at
Interesting.
him and I said, okay, Don. I was like, all right. So my child's daycare, and this was way back, like now, thankfully, there's government funding for child's daycare in Ontario, which is not easy
Mm.
to access, but it's made it a little bit more affordable. But back then, I was paying more than my rent in childcare alone per
Wow.
month. And I said to him, listen, this is how much childcare costs. So if you're committing to paying that per month, then I'll have another child. Y bien calladito que se quedó, nunca dijo nada más. Like it's just,
Yeah.
and y ahora hasta mi abuela, tengo mi hija, mis 2 perros, y hasta mi abuela, I'm like, son tus nietos, abuela. She's like, no, pero no son humanos. I'm like, son mis hijos. Yo soy like full millennial, right? I have my dogs and my plants and my daughter, like, and
Yeah.
so I'm like, son mis hijos, abuela. No, and so that's the thing. Like I always say, it's an intergenerational shift, where, we're
Mhm.
able to have a little bit more freedom. We're able to have a little bit more, and I think that privilege comes with living in Canada, the United States as well,
Yeah,
having that little bit of freedom and that influence from Western culture, essentially. Where
right.
back home, like I'm from Peru, so it's a very conservative country. It's a very traditional country. As much as people are trying to stir the pot and change things up a little bit, it's a very Catholic conservative country.
Uh,
So these thoughts are that, your family has to be a certain way. You have to be a certain way. Like, for example, of like me doing my academic work and going to a conference in Croatia or going to a conference in the UK, which have been incredible opportunities for me. Pero ¿cómo se va a ir y dejar a su hija y a su esposo solos en la casa? They don't recognize
yeah,
the value of what that
yeah,
means, that I
yeah,
am a human being outside of being a mother. I am Christie Lazo outside of being a mother. Being a mother
yeah,
is not everything. It's a very important part of me, and one of the most important parts of me, but it is not all of me.
right. I feel like just being that first gen bridge reaches so much beyond what we can perceive. As you're talking about it and you're bringing in different members of your family and how they perceive what you're doing, there have been moments in my journey where I look at that and I resent it a little, where it's just like, you don't get it. You should be maybe cheering me on for this, and yet you're holding me back or you're trying to push me down. And then also right now I'm feeling like the empathy. Like they
Mhm.
truly grew up in such a different space, culture, and as you've named privilege, I think it is a privilege to question. So, like,
Mhm.
we've come to a place to feel safe enough that even though it feels scary, we feel safe enough to question, like, well, why do I need to, let's say, have more than one child, or even stand up and say like, hey, well, this costs a lot, are you going to pay for it? Where in the past that would be like, ¿cómo te atreves responderle a tus papás así, no? Like,
Yeah.
que ajá, malcriada o falta de respeto or whatever it may be. Like, how amazing that we get to, yeah, to speak our mind, basically. Even though they're doing it too, they're speaking their mind. I don't think they fully got the phase of their life to question and
Yes.
then speak their mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you just reminded me of is this idea, and I've been seeing it a lot on TikTok when we're asked, "Oh, well, how could you do that to your mom? But that's your dad. How could you do that? How could they do those things to us?" My parents, for example, when we moved to Canada, that was like I said, I was raised mostly by because my parents worked by my grandma, my aunt, and then we had help in the home. And so when we moved to Canada, that was the first time my parents were full-time parents ever in their life, and they were in charge of a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old. They had never been full-time parents ever, like,
Wow.
that's a shock, and I realized that
Yeah.
much later on in life of like, "Oh my gosh, now that I'm a parent, imagine I just got a 7-year-old and 4-year-old, and I'm in charge of them, and I don't really know their full, like, routine. I don't really know, you
Yeah.
know?"
Yeah.
So a lot of our parents, for many reasons, whether it's immigration status, whether it's, financial situations, whatever, when you're in a new country, and this is very much ties into my research and my thesis of, focusing on immigrant mothers,
Yeah.
and their journeys and experiences as they migrate into new country and they're raising their children in host country. um, it's realizing that different different parts of that journey essentially cause our parents to be in survival mode, right? And
Mhm.
being in survival mode also triggers a lot of trauma that may have been so deep down inside. It just naturally all comes out, right? So,
Mm.
particularly through my dad, I had very difficult experiences with him growing up, where he decided, okay, I'm a father now, and I'm going to raise my children exactly like how, I was raised in Peru, but not in the city, like in Lima, but in Arequipa, in the chacra. Very
Mm.
traditional, very
Mhm.
patriarchal. That didn't work out so well for him when he was raising a rebel, like una rebelde, like the black sheep of the family.
Yeah.
But I see it with my brother where he was shaped from 4 years old being around that system that my
Mm.
brother, I tell him, like, be selfish, be a rebel. You don't have to be a people pleaser. Step out of that. Like I am like his little devil voice here.
The little chip on his shoulder.
Because like it's just um it's important to recognize that, like, yes, we do have that privilege in changing things up, um but at the same time, it's also recognizing that our parents came from so much, right? They also had their own experiences of so much, from, from joy to really traumatic experiences. And that's just the reality. Like,
Yeah.
I understand why my mom was so hyper protective of me in my teen years. My mom passed away almost 8 years ago. But which I wish I was able to have these conversations with her now, right? Since,
Mhm.
like, after she passed away, I went through so much, like, psychologically, mentally, that I started going to therapy. And as I'm healing, because I feel like that's a never ending journey, I'll be healing until I'm 86. but
Yeah.
but I feel like as I'm healing, I'm like, so many questions come up that I'm like, I wish I could ask her. I wish I could
Mm.
have these conversations with her, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it's so important to just have those questions, have those reflections with yourself. Even if you don't say them out loud all the time, even if it takes you, a few weeks to prepare to responder, aunque sea una vez.
See?
You have to practice in your room or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's important to recognize that it's baby steps on your end, and it's not always easy. Never easy, I would say. It's hard. But
Yeah.
also, giving not only other people grace, but giving yourself grace in that process.
Mhm. I always call it like this delicate dance between your journey and your parents' journey and
Yeah.
their level of understanding and your level of understanding. And sometimes you can give more grace to them than you, and then other times it's time to give you more grace than them. And
Yes.
yeah, it's, I think, like a balancing act constantly. Coming back to that survival mode, it's so true. I think we experienced it too in some way, and it's interesting porque we have an understanding of our parents' journey, they have an understanding of ours. But one thing that I think they can't tap into is that we don't have like that well, at least I was born here in the US. I don't have
Mhm.
that home country that, like, right now one of my parents is deciding to wanting to go back to Mexico, the home country, right?
Mhm.
I want to go back
Yeah.
home. And I'm like, when I was born here and when you were in survival mode and you guys were working all of the time, I didn't have that sense of home necessarily.
Yeah.
I don't, and so I don't have that craving to go back home. But also, like, now you're leaving this home where, like, we made this home here, and so it's just like it gives me insight into, like, maybe he's been in survival mode and he won't feel that relief until he gets back, which is crazy, right? And then for us, there's also a level of survival in some way because we are witnesses to the path that our parents are on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a popular narrative around this is we had to grow up. Many of us immigrant children had to grow up so fast. Not just immigrant
Mhm.
children, but children within immigrant families. We had to grow up so fast, right? Um, because we had to figure out a lot of life on our own, right? Because our
Mhm.
parents were still adapting to a new country, new practices, new approaches, all of
Yeah.
those pieces. And we did that without the internet. Like, kudos to all of us.
Yeah.
We did that without the internet, and I think that's amazing. Like, that's something we have to recognize.
Yeah.
From helping your parents translate a document to being on the phone with the cable company to, like, even translating at the parent teacher conference,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
such, like, so many different experiences that we were on that wild roller coaster ride with our parents.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time, I feel that, I don't want to generalize, but for a lot of us, I think the experience is that, um, we're we're not recognized for that,
Mm,
right?
mhm.
Like, it's not often
Yeah.
recognized that it's like, oh, it was hard for me. It was hard for, like, that's why it was for me, like, and that's why it's interesting. I've actually done a lot of reading around, like, why a lot of Gen X are narcissistic. And it's actually, if you look into it, I'm not going to like
Mm.
get full into it, but it's actually very, very interesting
Mhm.
how that generation is unfortunately, you know, very narcissist, like in nature. Their
Mm.
approaches are that way. Um, and I did that research from an angle of understanding how that affected our experiences as, you know,
Mm.
millennial or Gen Z, because yeah, we went through a lot along with them. I've always kind of been like, how the hell did this happen to me? Like, who thought that this was okay? Like, I arrived to Canada, I knew little to no English. Like, I knew the song, I don't know if anybody else knows it, but it was a song called like Pollito, Chicken, Gallina, Hen,
Aw.
Perro, Dog. Like, it was that song. That's all I knew. Like, that's it. But they registered me to school. They hopped me on a school bus and kind of said, good luck.
Wow.
You
Yeah.
know? And it was so like back then, I remember moments of feeling sick and like nauseous
Mm.
before getting on the
Mhm.
bus. And my parents would try to hurry me because, you know, like they had to get me to school to go to work, whatever it was. And I remember even like begging my mom of like, mom, like I had moved to Canada and I had brought my school uniform from Peru with me because it was such a piece of like
Mm.
my identity, right?
Yeah.
And I remember wanting to wear my school uniform here because I was like, it felt weird to wear normal clothes,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It
Mhm.
was very much culture shock, which now I'm like the nausea that I was feeling, like those like all I'm like that I had anxiety as a child, but
Mm.
nobody saw it that way,
Right. Yeah, because 'cause
right?
you're a kid. Se
You're
acostumbran más
exactly
rápido. Like, they'll figure it
that's
out.
it.
I think, like, there's parts that maybe they can't even imagine and that we can't even picture of what they were navigating, you know?
That's
Um,
it.
but I just think, like, at least at their age and thinking about your story, like, at least at their age, they had a communication. Maybe they found coworkers that spoke Spanish or, like, different things that
Mhm.
helped them feel okay, while maybe in your world, that wasn't the case, you know, or like you didn't have those skills built up to assimilate in the way that maybe they
Yeah.
thought it would be easy for you to do so.
No, that's right. And I think, you know, you often think of, like you mentioned, you're a kid, it'll be fine. You know, we don't consider the experiences of a child, or at least back then, much less to the degree that
Yeah.
they should be considered. In my work, I often, you know, a lot of you know, mommy influencers and parenting influencers are at the top of the iceberg. I'm looking like I'm scuba diving deep down underneath the water. And when I and
Mm.
one of the you know, systems of oppression that I often speak of is childism. Is we don't even think about things as childism because we've normalized it so deeply within our society, within our communities, within the way this lack of consideration to children and their experiences of
Mm.
essentially like oppression, right?
Mhm.
Because we think like, okay, they're going to be fine. Like, let's just, you know, send them off or it's going to be okay. But these are things that, you know, from us, like so many millennials are doing so much healing and we're trying to be better people. And, you know, it's because all of those elements that have impacted us in our earlier years that maybe people thought, oh no, it's okay, they'll be fine. But clearly we're not okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Ooh, okay. I had actually never heard the term childism, so I would love to dive deeper into that because I just had a recently had a conversation with a group of first gen moms. One of the things we talked about was the question of how has healing and awakening shifted the way you perceive your role and impact as a mother. And one of the things that came up as we were kind of like sharing is that I think growing up, what we perceived parenthood to be is providers, the role of a provider. I provide. And so there is a very clear distinction of this wall of parents provide, kids don't ask questions. And I think when potentially as parent, if our parents viewed themselves as providers, that was the root of a lot of how they acted with us, a lot of how they perceived us and treated us. And so that almost kind of sounds like parallel to what you're talking about, right? Where like there's not a deeper consideration of like what is their experience like emotionally, intellectually, etc. um because my role is provider. And so like, oh, do they have food? Are they going to school? Good, good, good. Okay, I'm doing my job, right? So yeah, maybe that leads into what it like childism is. If you could expand on that, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. I think to expand on your point first is a popular idea is, pero yo fui una buena madre. ¿Cómo vas a decir eso de
Mm-hmm.
mí? Yo fui un buen padre. ¿Cómo me vas a tratar así? Right? Like,
Yeah.
but how did you parent? Right? Like, it's okay. And that's what I think I wish like more of our parents would realize. Like, it's okay to say, I did my best. Yes, I effed up sometimes, and I'm sorry for that.
Mm-hmm.
But I truly, from the bottom of my heart, thought I was doing the right thing then. I
Right.
recognize your experiences. I recognize where you're coming from. I think that
Yeah.
in itself would be so healing for so many of us,
Yeah.
but it feels nearly impossible to hear. um, and it's very real, right? It's very real, and I think it's that part of like what the definition of parenting now versus the definition of parenting before, where we
Mm-hmm.
are not only thinking about the ways that we parent, but the ways that we were parented beyond just food on the table and a roof over your head. Because how dare you criticize my parenting if you had food on the table every single day?
Yeah.
When you don't address those emotions, and we see that especially in the machismo in Latinx
Mm-hmm.
communities, right? That comes from
Mm-hmm.
little boys having their needs not met, not being taught to emotionally regulate,
Regulate.
not being
Mm-hmm.
taught to name the feelings of anger, frustration, joy, not being taught. And I see this with my own brother, I see this with my husband. They, other men that I speak to, like, they can't name their feelings. And
Right.
at like 30 something, they're trying to learn this and figure it out. And that's
Yeah.
really, really hard. This like whole idea of childism comes from, it's similar to when we talk about like, racism or other systems of oppression. Like, it's essentially a type of oppression that we're posing on children. And we don't often
Mm.
recognize it because it's so normalized. It comes from this idea dating back to um, very like colonial times. It was this idea that children are to be seen but not heard. It's like the time dated back to Bridgerton,
Okay.
that era. And it was
Uh-huh.
this idea of children are to be seen but not heard, right?
Mm.
And so it very much stems from that. Like, children essentially were, you have children to populate the church, you have children to
Mm.
showcase
Wow.
that you have an heir, you have
Wow.
children were essentially accessories to the system, not seen as human,
Mm.
as their own identities, their own people. Like, they were just an extension of, which is very
Mhm.
contrary to many of our indigenous cultures, which children were very much part of community. They were part of rituals. They
Wow.
were part, so it's a total like opposite contrast to how many of our indigenous ancestors saw children versus the colonial aspects of children as accessories, right?
Oh my
I think
gosh.
for today's time, one of the most, I guess, well-known ways that we can talk about childism is people not wanting children on an airplane, people
Mm.
getting very,
Mm.
very annoyed about children on an airplane. And I think it's important to recognize children are little humans. They're learning every single day, they're growing every single day, and they need that grace, right? We expect
Mhm.
children to grow up so incredibly quickly. We expect children to catch up to routine, to our environments, to,
Oh my gosh.
everything, and act like little adults. We even dress them like little adults thanks to influencer culture. And is that okay? Are we okay with that? Like, do we want our children to grow up so fast? Do we want our 10-year-old doing TikTok videos about the haul she did at Sephora? Like, do
Yeah.
we want that? Is that a
Yeah. It's
healthy
like
childhood?
streamlining
So
them into these systems already, you know? It's like, here you go,
Exactly.
lighting them up. I wonder
Mhm.
if, as part of like what you're doing, if you explore, I imagine yes, but like how other countries or people are starting to raise their families and playing with this idea of like kids are people and they're little sponges that can absorb for good and for bad. Because in the spiritual awakening world, there's these cool, I don't know, concepts and things that I have tapped into of like, let's say, like free learning, right? So, like, I think
Mhm.
they kind of remove the boxes of now we're doing math and now we're doing English and just allowing for the child to learn because they naturally learn all the time. So taking them out of these systems, out of these routines. But what I have heard from them too, or in maybe tapping into to some of that stuff, is the fear of like, well, I'm not sure this is gonna work, but we won't know unless we try, you know? So
Yeah.
I don't know, would love to know like if you tap into the maybe out of the box stuff out there.
Yeah, so first and foremost, like naturally, as I reconnect with my indigenous ancestry, because I was brought up like, in when I was in Peru, it was, we're Peruvian, but the colorism and racismo in our culture, it was like, oh, but we have Spaniard ancestors. And I
Mm.
was never tapped into what it meant to be indigenous, right? Because of the
Mm.
elitism, classism that comes with that you suffer from, like from being indigenous, right? Because these like systems, and I think this happens across all of the Americas, right?
Mhm.
And so when I came to Canada, it was okay. I'm from Peru, but they're telling me I'm Latina. Okay, so let me be Latina. But now I'm reconnecting since marrying my husband, who's also from Peru, and having a
Mm.
daughter who racially is more indigenous than even I am. I was like, I need to reconnect. I need to
Mm.
find out more in order to teach her about where she comes from, make her proud of her ancestry, and so that she doesn't have to cry about not having blue eyes and blonde hair like I did when I was a little girl, right?
Mhm.
And so, why I say that is I'm really tapping into Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous knowledge systems. And that comes from this idea of learning from different and knowledge, like Indigenous. I know, for example, like, being from Peru, the likelihood, or where my dad is from, where my family's from, it's likely that I'm Quechua, and so I've been learning not only more about Quechua, but learning in Canada. I've had the privilege of also, learning from Indigenous communities here, such as like Anishinaabe communities, and just recognizing that, the Americas are one land, one people, right? We migrated back and forth, we traded, we're so connected in so many ways. So much of that was taken away with colonialism, right? Whether it was the French and the English in the north, or the Spanish, the Portuguese, etc., in the South, right? So it's one of my most viral videos that I did on TikTok was when I said, conscious parenting. I said like positive parenting. At the end of the day, it's all decolonized parenting. We're just columbusing it and renaming it something
Mm.
new so that
Okay,
it's
yeah.
trendy for these white moms. But like,
Yeah.
like let's go down to essentially like what it is, right? It's
Mm.
decolonized systems of parenting where we're actually
Mm.
reconnecting with our children. And so that's where the decolonized really like comes from, but it's also,
Mhm.
dismantling those colonial systems of oppression. And I often look at like global indigeneity, right? Folks that come from the Middle East, from Africa, like they're indigenous to those lands, right? So how do we recognize those knowledge systems as well that we know are much healthier than what we've learned from colonialism, right?
I think this whole conversation, I mean, it's just so, I don't want to say refreshing, but it's just like so aligned to be able to question these things and talk about them. And there's always like this empowering feeling alongside powerlessness, porque I think that a lot of us are questioning, a lot of us are thinking deeper. Like I love that you say you dive deeper, you scuba dive or something like that, like deeper. Cuz that's what I think that not a lot of people do that, or we're so in survival mode that we're okay with the little like finger dipped in Nutella that they give us, and like we buy that, you know, and we're like, oh, okay, so everything's okay, okay, I can go back to my life, you know. And unfortunately, I think we have to be aware, we have to be vigilant, and
Yes.
we have to fight for what we're finding out and figuring out. And I think that, you know, like I said, the name Decolonized Motherhood is so powerful because it touches on all of those things. You know, it touches on stuff that I think is really apparent and then also isn't. You know, there's
Mm-hmm.
so much to that. And I just wonder also how your work is going to evolve as these times evolve. And I hope that people like you and I and everyone else get louder, not quieter. I know that it almost feels
Yeah.
like, you know, it's like we're entering, I don't know, como que the resistance is like getting louder on the other end. I think I don't know if you felt it, but I felt like maybe the last 10, 15 years, a lot of people were getting that impulse of questioning, opening your mind, exploring, like, how could it be better? And then now that everyone's kind of like tapped in, it's just like whew, this weight on the other side. And I know this is a little bit of a tangent, but I just feel like it's important to talk about porque yo sé que people that are listening to are also on this path and are also maybe feeling the duality of the
Yeah.
inspiration and then the like, you know, the fear of everything that could potentially happen.
It's not even like a tangent because it's very much ties into the motherhood space, right? Like how alone and lack of a community that mothers have, right? Like a lot of us, we don't. Like me, I have very small family, I have very few friends. Like, you know, here in Canada I'm so busy that like unless my friends are super understanding of my busy lifestyle because I work full time, I go to school part time, and I'm a mom, and then on top of
Mm,
that I'm trying to, you know, live a healthy life, right?
yeah,
And so it's a lot, right? So it's hard sometimes to nurture community and nurture those relationships within your life as a parent. But it very much ties in because we have to remember one thing. And once again, I create a lot of content about this on my TikTok, which is, you know, to really remember that if we are on our own and we are not connecting with other people, we are letting them win.
mm,
Um, One of my most significant critiques that I've noticed, you know, living elsewhere and then coming to live here in Canada, in the US, like those systems of oppression thrive from our individualistic society,
yeah,
right? So when we're only thinking about ourselves, like I'm comfortable, I'm fine, I don't have to see anything, I'm gonna just sit in my privilege, right? That's when those systems are thriving. But those systems
yeah,
are affecting communities because you need to realize that, like, you may be fine in your little casita, but your child is going to school with other kids who are maybe severely
yeah,
affected. You are going to work with other people that could be severely affected. Like these are the spaces that you're living in when you walk down the street, when you go to the coffee shop, when you know what I mean? Like
yeah,
we're all connected, right? So many of these things are connected. And we really need to, you know, take a step back and look at the bigger picture because they want you to focus on this tiny little thing right here, these little like silly distractions, right?
mm,
You know, and one of my recent critiques has been, you know, even the tariffs, while that is a significant hit to so many people, that's also being used as a distraction in the media for many other things that are happening in everyday communities that we're living in, right? And so I think it's important to just look at that, to take a step back and look at that bigger picture. Another thing that I often advocate because I keep saying, you know, my academic work. I'm doing a
mm,
master's in an MA in social justice education. And so one of the things that I often say is, you know, we often feel that advocacy and social justice work has to be like holding a sign at a protest.
right,
And while that is important, numbers are important at protests, that's not the only thing we can do, right?
yeah,
There's different pieces. Like one of the things I've shared in my content is, you know, think of it kind of like a business, a corporation, you know. I may not be able to go to all the protests, but call me the marketing department because I'm out here creating social content and educating the people that are willing to listen, right?
yeah,
And so that's it. Everybody serves a purpose within a community, within a
Yeah.
system, within a family, etc. Right? Everybody has a purpose. So even if it's something as little as like you telling your friend about like, listen, I saw this on the news, like that's really concerning, like that's a fellow mother that this happened to, you know, have just a small chat conversation, and you never know how you can open up somebody's eyes, how you can, influence their perspective a little bit to shift in a positive way, because those little bits of education are so important, because those plant seeds to get people thinking,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
When that tío is, sitting on at, the asado, like making a racist joke, say, hey, that's not funny, that's actually really racist. And when people are like, haha, no, like blah blah, no, it's racist, period. It's like those, like planting those little seeds, because the next time they do it, they might like be like, like be like tontos about it, but the next time they try to do it in your presence, they're gonna think about it twice, and they
Right.
might even think about it twice in another space. You know what I mean? Because they'll finally have heard it from somebody, right?
It's so
So
interesting. Like those theos, I mean, I've had so many debates with those theos, you can't even imagine.
yeah.
And it's like, I feel like a part of them knows it's truth. Like they know. But then they're
Hmm.
like, let me debate, double down on it. I'm just like, deep down, you know, this is wrong. Like, and
Yeah.
that's why you're fighting it. Just like, I don't
But
know.
it's
It's just,
because, like, you know what it is? It's the people around them accept it and they laugh at it. So they want to be
yeah.
like the cool Theo at the party, and he's so
Yeah.
funny. Like, no, you're actually really racist and problematic.
Right.
you
Yeah.
know? Um, and that's it. Like, they just want their little 5 minutes of fame. That's
Yeah. They're
basically
five
it,
minutes
right?
away.
Like, that's it. They just want that.
Yeah.
But it's ingrained in our culture, right? Like I remember there was a show in Peru in when I was a little girl, and I remember watching this show and I was like, this is not okay. And I don't know if it was like that I had a sense of like justice already built into me genetically. I don't know. But I remember being a little girl, like around 5 years old, and watching this show when I was living in Peru. It was called Risas y Salsa. And I remember like seeing these characters that were in blackface. And I remember looking at them and being like, this
Mm.
doesn't seem okay. Like, this is not right. This isn't okay. But people watched it and it was very mainstream. Like, it was absolutely normal. Even like women, I remember I would always ask my mom, like, Ma, pero ¿por qué las mujeres siempre están calatas? Like, why? Why are they not wearing any clothes? Why are they in thong bikinis in this comedy
Yeah.
show all the time
Yeah.
and being grabbed by the men on these comedy shows and touched in
Yeah.
inappropriate ways? Like, Mom, why? And I was told, oh, así es nomás, like, it's just like that, like, accept it.
Yeah.
And there was always, like, a little piece of me that was like, it doesn't feel okay. Like, it doesn't, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's very, unfortunately, like, normalized. A lot of folks were, growing up. And we know that in US, in a lot, not just US, like in Western media history, there's a lot of problematic images and
Yeah.
representations of different folks from around the world,
Right.
right? And it was normalized. So we've been able to, for the most part, most of us have been able to say this isn't right. Some people are still okay with it. In Spanish, we have a saying, it's called like, tienes que poner tu granito de arena, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
like if everybody does their little grain of sand, you create a beach,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? That's what that
Yes.
is. It's like everybody, like you don't have to be at every protest, but in your spaces, just putting in your granito de arena, right? Of like, how are you making a difference?
Yeah, I think like you're naming it's not integration, but it's integrity. There we go. Like what level of integrity do you hold for yourself and then to the people around you? So I do think that yeah, as a mother, I imagine that's super important. On your website of Decolonized Motherhood, I saw you mentioned like parenting with purpose. That's something that you're focusing on. What does that look like day to day for you? I think you're naming some, which is like, okay, seeing who is a part of your circle, paying attention to how people speak and who they are. But what are other versions of that that you keep in mind or that you prioritize in your day to day?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just being conscious of why I do the things I do.
Okay.
Not only just as an adult, but also as a mother, right? That parenting with a purpose piece. And I say as an adult and as a woman, because my daughter's always watching. So I could do things a certain way as a parent, but if I'm doing things as like when she's around and I'm doing some things as an adult that are maybe contrary to what I'm teaching her, it's like I
Yeah.
have to lead through example.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So,
Okay.
that's one of the reasons why I decided to get into higher ed. Yes, I knew it was going to be very, very hard to do my master's and eventually I'll get to my PhD. But this was a sueñito that I had, when I became a mother. And I want to
Mm-hmm.
show her through example that as much as this is for me, I want to show her
Mm-hmm.
through example that if she has a sueñito, like not only can she chase it and achieve it, but I'm going to be right there to support her, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it's being very, very intentional about why you do things. So sometimes, for example, my husband and I have really good conversations about this. And in regards to, for example, like when she was little, especially when she was a toddler, I remember one of the most significant challenges that we had, and this was like a big awakening moment for us, was siéntate en la mesa y termina tu plato. And she was like
Mm-hmm.
3 years old, maybe 2, 3 years old. Like, you have to sit there and finish everything on your plate. And then one day I was like, wait a minute, is that reasonable? Is that a reasonable request first to finish everything on your plate when she's not fully hungry? Maybe she had, how many snacks at daycare and she's coming home and we're expecting her to have more food.
Yeah.
So I'm like, is that a reasonable request, right? Is it a reasonable request for me to expect a 3-year-old to sit at the table for the time that we are having dinner, which is half an hour? Is that a reasonable
Mm-hmm.
request? Like, I get
Mm-hmm.
bored in 10 minutes if somebody makes me sit in a chair in a waiting room. And
Yeah.
that's why people look at their phones. As an adult, you get bored. Even if you try to put your phone away for 5 minutes, you're already bored and you take out your phone. Children don't have the
Mm-hmm.
capability of doing that.
Right.
We don't realize that as adults, that we whip out our phones when we're bored.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to really like think about that and also have conversations with my husband about, what if we just, when she says she's done, she's done. So he was like, but no, she has to eat her food because then she's going to ask for another snack. He's like a little bit, he was not anymore, but he was more traditional than I was.
Okay.
So he's like, no, but she's going to eat something else after and she's not going to eat her food. And I was like, okay, let's meet in the middle. She says she wants to get up from the table. She's done. Let's let her get up from the table. We can have, because we were having like, it was very frustrating at the table when we were like,
Mm.
come, 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 and she didn't want to eat. It was very
Yeah.
frustrating. So I said, you know what? Where can we find peace? How can
Mm.
we find peace? And
Mm-hmm.
so we said, okay, we met in the middle and said, okay, let's let her get up, but her plate will be right here. And if she says she wants a snack later, we will teach her that her plate is right here and she can finish what's on her plate. And until that plate is done, she's not going to get a new snack. She's not going to get a new thing. Um, I also had at the time a conversation with my family doctor. And I said to him, like, listen, I'm worried she's not eating. And he's like, your child is not going to starve. She's
Mm.
not going to starve. Do not worry. But it's these practices that we were taught of like, you
Yeah.
have to be thankful for the food on the table. You have to finish it. Like, how dare you? Like, my husband, for example, it breaks his heart to throw food away, right? Like, it literally, like,
Mm-hmm.
I see the impact. And sometimes he eats more than he should because he's like, I can't throw it away. My grandma,
Oh,
same
okay.
thing. She's like that. She's like, oh, yo me lo como, right?
Yeah.
And then she's like, no sé por qué estoy gordita. and but I'm like, and that's the thing, like, of like, um, we're taught to eat, but we're not listening to our bodies. So one of the things I presented to my husband was like, this goes beyond just asking her to finish all her food. This goes towards consent. We are
Mm-hmm.
teaching her to push beyond what her own body is telling her
Yeah.
and her own boundaries, right? And that's also a part
So
of
important.
childism, of showing her,
Mm.
especially as a little girl, which,
Yeah.
things related to consent can happen to all genders, right? But as a little girl, she is more likely to be confronted with dangerous situations if she does not know how to set boundaries, listen to her intuition, listen to herself, and is
Yes.
informed about consent.
Yeah.
right?
So
So that was a
important.
very important piece for
Yeah.
us.
When I work one to one with people on like authenticity and tapping into your
Mhm.
intuition, it starts there. Like, even though I'm talking to an adult, who I'm actually working with is the inner child
Yeah,
who
absolutely.
who who was taught what your body is telling you is actually not real, because you are
Yeah,
not full. You are full until you finish your plate. And
that's
so
it.
then that translates, kind of a lot of the different things we've touched on in today's episode. Then the child has emotions and the parent says, you have no right to feel this way. So then the inner child is told, your emotions aren't valid. And so then, and it just keeps building up. And then at a work
That's it.
environment as a worker. So it's so beautiful and important to recognize, like, it starts there. It's like
Yeah.
any of the work that I do over here, like, we're going back to that, porque,
Yeah.
like, yeah, because it's not about like who you are now. It's what did you learn and how did you learn to
Yes.
communicate with your body. And so beautiful that that you guys, you said, you called it like a moment of awakening for you guys. And I think,
Hmm.
I hope that even helps others listening too. You asked two really important questions, which is this reasonable, and how can we find peace? I think you said it that way.
Yeah.
So I love the idea of the listeners kind of taking that away, like questioning what you're doing, through the lens of reasonable, or is this what we want? Is this actually what we want to be
Hmm.
teaching our child? And then if it's different from what we were taught, how can we find peace in the situation?
Yep.
Maybe we were taught this solution, but there's different ones. And so the idea that you had, which is like, you still have to come back to your plate if you're hungry, but only if you're hungry también, it's not like you
Yeah.
have to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, that's it. And I think, I was a child that I always grew up asking why. And my parents would get so frustrated.
Mm,
They'd be like,
mhm.
oh, tienes que hacer esto. ¿Por qué? And then I would get like, and they'd be like, because I said so. And I'm like, but I'm asking you, like, no contestes, like I was like, why are you answering back
Mhm.
at me? Like, that's, we don't think about that twice, but that's also a practice of childism, like that silencing of the children in what they have to say, right?
Yeah.
And so I'd be like, but I just want to know why. If you explain to me why, I'm not going to have an issue doing it. I just want to know why.
Yeah.
That's a reasonable ask. But it
Right.
was always like because I said so. Right? So I always one of the things I practiced with my daughter was everything, and this as to your last question of being conscious every day of if I'm asking her to do something, I'm explaining why. So if I'm telling her
Mm.
to not jump on the couch because you could fall and get an ouch. That's the term, the
Mm.
ouch was the term we use for you're going to get hurt, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, don't play on there like this because this is the consequence. This is what could happen, right? Or like, I'm asking you to do this because, for example, like, one of the things that we're working through now that she's, a tween is have your space be tidy. It doesn't have to be perfectly pristine clean, but at least tidy, and I say to her, like, because this is your living space and you want a healthy and positive space for you. If this is
Mm.
dirty, it's got like you've got like candy wrappers on one side, you've got other chaos going on, this is not a healthy space for you to be in. Right? So
Mhm.
I'm starting to like upgrade a little bit into her speaking to her as a toddler, speaking to her as a small
Right.
child, and now speaking to her as a tween, and really teaching her about self-care. It goes beyond having cute running shoes. Self-care
Right.
is, your spaces. How are you caring for those spaces? How are you caring for your home? Right?
Mm.
So yeah, it's being very, very intentional about what my ask is, explaining to her why it's happening this way, because I think that that goes a long way. And you're also nurturing communication with your child, right? A
Mm.
lot of people try to
Mhm.
start nurturing communication with their children when they're a teenager. The teenager, if you have not nurtured
Yeah.
communication with your child, a teenager's not going to be interested in talking to you. That's too late,
Mm. Mhm.
right? So it's
Mhm.
learning to plant those seeds very, very early on, um, in order to essentially like have a little bit more peace later on in your child's life, right?
Yeah. Wow, I love that. You're also then building a skill that will allow for them to have the capacity basically to have conversations as they are also navigating their own emotional ups and downs and changes, and yeah, as they're
Yeah.
evolving.
There's so many added layers, right? Like for myself, I also grew up, for example, knowing that I had ADHD. But my parents, it's like, oh,
Mm,
you don't, no tienes nada. No, like it's fine. Like, whatever. Like at
yeah.
37 years old, I got diagnosed. And the
Wow.
tears of validation I cried when that doctor said to me,
Mm,
you have ADHD, which is a combination, which means I have hyperactivity and inattentiveness. The validation I felt as a child who was always seen as, ay, ¿por qué tienes que ser tan problemática? Because I asked why.
mm,
As a black
mhm.
sheep, as like, so there's all these added layers to your experience as not only like a person, but how it plays into your parenting, right? And
Yeah.
my daughter also, we went through the journey together because I was like, how dare I, you know, make my daughter go through this journey or say this is the best thing for her to, potentially get diagnosed with something because I saw
Mm.
all the symptoms in her that I had in myself as a child, right?
Oh, yeah.
And I said, how am I going to tell her this is the best thing for her if I'm not practicing it myself? So we went through the journey together of getting diagnosed parallel. We had our own
Mm,
doctors, she had pediatricians, and I had um, but going through that journey and also like, um, recognizing that that's an added layer to my parenting. One of the biggest takeaways for me for that, and I said to the doctor, they're like, what do you want to get from this? Like, why do you want to be diagnosed as an adult? And one of the biggest takeaways was like, I know that I don't have as much patience as I should have with my daughter because of my neurodivergence, because of ADHD, right?
mhm.
So it's also like looking within yourself, right? And I'm not saying, this applies to everybody because it's like I said, it's different circumstances, these added layers. I always like to look at things as layers. It's
Yeah.
added layers that
Mhm.
could contribute to your experience, right?
Mhm.
Of why
Mhm.
you're a certain way. And maybe, it's very real to struggle with certain things because, like you said, as an inner child, there's so much your inner child struggled with or experienced that you may not even realize into adulthood. That then
Right.
when you become a parent, it becomes very, very apparent of how one of the things that I also very much acknowledge was because of my ADHD. Like, but I've talked to other moms who also experience that mom rage and the guilt that they feel around that mom rage. That is so real,
Mm,
right? And recognizing that of like, you're not a bad mom, you're not a bad person. It's like, how do you take a step back and acknowledge first and foremost that this is happening,
mhm.
and then do ideally seek support. It's okay to seek support because that's another thing. You're not alone. You don't have to go through everything on your own. Seek
Yeah.
support to make it healthier, not only for yourself but for your children and your household. Everybody's journey is very unique and there's a lot of layers. But yeah, I think it's just so important to recognize that like you're a human outside of being a parent,
Yeah.
and to really take care of yourself through that, even
Yeah.
if it means whatever, sitting outside sometimes, like just sit out, like something, just that like quietness or whatever it is, simple little things that bring you joy, like maybe if it's reading a book or whatever it is, little things that bring you joy. That's so important because that fills your cup, right?
Yeah, that rediscovery I think is huge, and everything we've talked about just sounds like a rewiring, questioning and rewiring, unlearning and
Mm-hmm.
learning.
Yeah.
Porque all of these labels that were placed on people, maybe like for you, rebelde, when really you were seeking understanding, or for someone else like chillona, when really they were seeking empathy, all of these labels that sometimes we hold shame around, or we build our whole lives around, like, oh, this is who I am, or rebelling against it. Like all of this stuff, I think it's worth questioning because we're seeing, even in this conversation, how things kind of come about, and they're typically not because it's you. It's more like because of the familial systems you grew up around, the government or the societal conditioning you grew up around. So like there's a lot of, like you said, layers. I love layers too. That's how I perceive people. It's like through layers. So I think it's the same. It's like there's so many layers to the experience that you had, and it's worth questioning it because
Yeah.
potentially, and I think most of us who are doing the work know it's powerful, but also you find
Mhm.
freedom there. You
Yeah.
find freedom from all of this weight that sometimes you just go around life carrying. Um, so yeah, super, super powerful stuff. Thank you so much for having this conversation. And I definitely want to give you a moment to share a little bit more about decolonized motherhood, where they can find you. You mentioned TikTok, so we know we can find you there. But yeah, like your social media, your podcast if you're still doing it, your website, whatever you would like to share.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. So you can find everything on decolonizedmotherhood.com. I've been a little bit quieter on there, but I'm hoping to start updating it soon. I'm working on my MA thesis right now, so that's
Ooh.
taken up all my free time. But because I am taking a little bit of a break from academia studies, then I'm going to have a little bit more time, which means I can get back into podcasting. So I'm hoping
Mm.
to this summer launch the Decolonized Motherhood podcast and get back into podcasting. It'll just be basically where I left off in Vida with Christie. It's a natural, life transition. So you're
Yeah.
more than welcome to look up Decolonized Motherhood podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, and you'll find my previous episodes. Feel free. I think there's almost like 50 of them or something.
Wow.
And you could just tune in there. And then, of course, you can find me on TikTok, Decolonized Motherhood. And that's where you find like the sassiest version of me. And I have a lot of fun on there. And I try as much as I can to post daily on there. So mainly it's, those critical thinking pieces. I drop a lot of gems in there.
I imagine, decolonized motherhood, like that name is really strong, and it probably, has people questioning you and you questioning others. And I applaud you for stepping into that, and for using your voice in the way that you do, porque it's important. And I think like you said, it adds a big granito de arena into the sea or the ocean of change that we need to see in our communities, in our societies. We were just talking about too, like how our communities are so good at having the quinceañeras and the bodas and the bautizos, but not always like this part, like the
Yeah.
support and or maybe not as loud, like the support around, let's say, new mothers, or even mothers with teens or whatever it may be. I think
Yeah.
that it's important to also be as loud with that. So I think you're playing a role in that, and
Mhm.
I'm sure many mothers appreciate that, and parents in general. Well, thank you so much. Thank you everyone too for listening. Please make sure that you share this with anyone that you feel would find this helpful. Your mom friends, even padres, dads need to listen to this information también. So yeah, I think like please share it with whoever you think would enjoy this content or it could support them in any way. And as always, first gens, remember that I love you, I love me, and I can't wait for you to love yourself. Bye.